15. Knitting. There had been earlier drinking than usual in the wine shop of Monsieur Defarge. As early as 6 o'clock in the morning, sallow faces peeping through its barred windows had descried other faces within, bending over measures of wine. Monsieur Defarge sold a very thin wine at the best of times, but it would seem to have been an unusually thin wine that he sold at this time. A sour wine, moreover, or a souring, for its influence on the mood of those who drank it was to make them gloomy. No vivacious bacchanalian flame leaped out of the pressed grape of Monsieur Defarge, but a smouldering fire that burnt in the dark lay hidden in the dregs of it. This had been the third morning in succession on which there had been early drinking at the wine shop of Monsieur Defarge. It had begun on Monday, and here was Wednesday come. There had been more of early brooding than drinking, for many men had listened and whispered and slunk about there from the time of the opening of the door, who could not have laid a piece of money on the counter to save their souls. These were to the full as interested in the place, however, as if they could have commanded whole barrels of wine, and they glided from seat to seat and from corner to corner, swallowing talk in lieu of drink with greedy looks. Notwithstanding an unusual flow of company, the master of the wine shop was not visible. He was not missed, for nobody who crossed the threshold looked for him, nobody asked for him, nobody wondered to see only Madame Defarge in her seat, presiding over the distribution of wine with a bowl of battered small coins before her, as much defaced and beaten out of their original impress as the small coinage of humanity from whose ragged pockets they had come. A suspended interest and a prevalent absence of mind were perhaps observed by the spies who looked in at the wine shop, as they looked in at every place high and low, from the king's palace to the criminal's jail. Games at cards languished, players at dominoes musingly built towers with them, drinkers drew figures on the table with spilt drops of wine. Madame Defarge herself picked out the pattern on her sleeves with her toothpick, and saw and heard something invisible and inaudible a long way off. Thus, Saint Antoine, in this vinous feature of his, until midday. It was high noontide, when 2 dusty men passed through his streets and under his swinging lamps, of whom one was Monsieur Defarge, the other a mender of roads in a blue cap. All adust and athirst, the 2 entered the wine shop. Their arrival lighted a kind of fire in the breast of Saint Antoine, fast spreading as they came along, which stirred and flickered in flames of faces at most doors and windows. Yet no one had followed them, and no man spoke when they entered the wine shop, though the eyes of every man there were turned upon them. "Good day, gentlemen," said Monsieur Defarge. It may have been a signal for loosening the general tongue. It elicited an answering chorus of "Good day." "It is bad weather, gentlemen," said Defarge, shaking his head, upon which every man looked at his neighbor, and then all cast down their eyes and sat silent, except one man, who got up and went out. "My wife," said Defarge aloud, addressing Madame Defarge, "I have travelled 7 leagues with this good mender of roads, called Jacques. I met him by accident a day and a half's journey out of Paris. He is a good child, this mender of roads, called Jacques. Give him to drink, my wife." The second man got up and went out. Madame Defarge set wine before the mender of roads, called Jacques, who doffed his blue cap to the company and drank. In the breast of his blouse he carried some coarse dark bread. He ate of this between whiles, and sat munching and drinking near Madame Defarge's counter. A third man got up and went out. Defarge refreshed himself with a draught of wine, but he took less than was given to the stranger, as being himself a man to whom it was no rarity, and stood waiting until the countryman had made his breakfast. He looked at no one present, and no one now looked at him, not even Madame Defarge, who had taken up her knitting and was at work. "Have you finished your repast, friend?" he asked in due season. "Yes, thank you." "Come then, You shall see the apartments that I told you could occupy. It will suit you to a marvel. Out of the wine shop into the street, out of the street into a courtyard, out of the courtyard up a steep staircase, out of the staircase into a garret. Formerly the garret where a white-haired man sat on a low bench, stooping forward and very busy making shoes. No white-haired man was there now, but the 3 men were there who had gone out of the wine shop singly, and between them and the white-haired man afar off was the one small link that they had once looked in at him through the chinks in the wall. Defarge closed the door carefully and spoke in a subdued voice. "Jacques 1, Jacques 2, Jacques 3. This is a witness encountered by appointment. By me, Jacques 4. He will tell you all. Speak, Jacques 5. The mender of roads, blue cap in hand, wiped his swarthy forehead with it and said, "Where shall I commence, monsieur?" "Commence," was Monsieur Defarge's not unreasonable reply. "That's a commencement." "I saw him then, messieurs," began the mender of roads, "a year ago this running summer, underneath the carriage of the Marquis, hanging by the chain. Behold the manner of it. I leaving my work on the road, the sun going to bed, the carriage of the Marquis slowly ascending the hill, he hanged by the chain like this." Again the mender of roads went through the whole performance, in which he ought to have been perfect by that time, seeing that it had been the infallible resource and indispensable entertainment of his village during a whole year. Jacques 1 struck in and asked if he had ever seen the man before. "Never," answered the mender of roads, recovering his perpendicular. Jacques 3 demanded how he afterwards recognized him then. "By his tall figure," said the mender of the roads softly, and with his finger at his nose. "When Monsieur the Marquis demands that evening, 'Say what he is like,' I make response, 'Tall as a spectre.'" "You should have said, 'Short as a dwarf,'" returned Jacques 2. "Well, what did I know? The deed was not then accomplished, neither did he confide in me. Observe, under those circumstances even I do not offer my testimony. Monsieur the Marquis indicates me with his finger standing near our little fountain and says, 'To me bring that rascal.' My face, messieurs, I offer nothing." "He is right there, Jacques," murmured Defarge to him who had interrupted. "Go on." "Good," said the mender of roads with an air of mystery. "The tall man is lost, and he is sought. How many months? 9, 10, 11? No matter the number," said Defarge. "He is well hidden, but at last he is unluckily found. Go on." "I am again at work upon the hillside, and the sun is again about to go to bed. I am collecting my tools to descend to my cottage down in the village below, where it is already dark, when I raise my eyes and see coming over the hill 6 soldiers. In the midst of them is a tall man with his arms bound, tied to his sides like this. With the aid of his indispensable cap, he represented a man with his elbows bound fast at his hips, with cords that were knotted behind him. I stand aside, messieurs, by my heap of stones, to see the soldiers and the prisoner pass, for it is a solitary road, that where any spectacle is well worth looking at. And at first, as they approach, I see no more than that they are 6 soldiers with a tall man bound, and that they are almost black to my sight, except on the side of the sun going to bed, where they have a red edge, messieurs. Also, I see that their long shadows are on the hollow ridge on the opposite side of the road, and are on the hill above it, and are like the shadows of giants. Also, I see that they are covered with dust, and that the dust moves with them as they come, tramp, tramp. But when they advance quite near to me, I recognize the tall man, and he recognizes me. But he would be well content to precipitate himself over the hillside once again, as on the evening when he and I first encountered close to the same spot. He described it as if he were there, and it was evident that he saw it vividly. Perhaps he had not seen much in his life. "I do not show the soldiers that I recognize the tall man. He does not show the soldiers that he recognizes me. We do it, and we know it, with our eyes." "Come on," says the chief of that company, pointing to the village. "Bring him fast to his tomb." And they bring him faster. I follow. His arms are swelled because of his being bound so tight. His wooden shoes are large, clumsy, and he is lame. Because he is lame, inconsequently slow, they drive him with their guns like this. He imitated the action of a man's being impelled forward by the butt ends of muskets. As they descend the hill like madmen running a race, he falls. They laugh and pick him up again. His face is bleeding and covered with dust, but he cannot touch it. Thereupon they laugh again. They bring him into the village. All the village runs to look. They take him past the mill and up to the prison. All the village sees the prison gate open in the darkness of the night and swallow him like this. He opened his mouth wide as he could and shut it with a sounding snap of his teeth. Observant of his unwillingness to mar the effect by opening it again, Defarge said, "Go on, Jacques." "All the village," pursued the mender of roads, on tiptoe and in a low voice, "withdraws. All the village whispers by the fountain. All the village sleeps. All the village dreams of that unhappy one within the locks and bars of the prison on the crag, and never to come out of it except to perish. In the morning, with my tools upon my shoulder, eating my morsel of black bread as I go, I make a circuit by the prison on my way to my work. There I see him, high up behind the bars of a lofty iron cage, bloody and dusty as last night, looking through. He has no hand free to wave to me. I dare not call to him. He regards me like a dead man." Defarge and the three glanced darkly at one another. The looks of all of them were dark, repressed, and revengeful, as they listened to the countryman's story. The manner of all of them, while it was secret, was authoritative too. They had the air of a rough tribunal. Jacques 1 and 2 sitting on the old pallet bed, each with his chin resting on his hand, and his eyes intent on the road mender. Jacques 3, equally intent, on one knee behind them, with his agitated hand always gliding over the network of fine nerves about his mouth and nose. Defarge, standing between them and the narrator, whom he had stationed in the light of the window, by turns looking from him to them and from them to him. "Go on, Jacques," said Defarge. "He remains up there in his iron cage some days. The village looks at him by stealth, for it is afraid, but always looks up from a distance at the prison on the crag. And in the evening, when the work of the day is achieved, and it assembles to gossip at the fountain, all faces are turned towards the prison. Formerly they were turned towards the posting-house. Now they turn towards the prison. They whisper at the fountain that although condemned to death, he will not be executed. They say that petitions have been presented in Paris, showing that he was enraged and made mad by the death of his child. They say that a petition has been presented to the king himself. What do I know? It is possible. Perhaps yes, perhaps no. Listen, then, Jacques. Number 1 of that name sternly interposed. Know that a petition was presented to the king and queen. All here, yourself excepted, saw the king take it in his carriage in the street, sitting beside the queen. It is Defarge, whom you see here, who at the hazard of his life darted out before the horses with the petition in his hand. And once again, listen, Jacques. said the kneeling number 3, his fingers ever wandering over and over those fine nerves, with a strikingly greedy air, as if he hungered for something that was neither food nor drink.
"The guard, horse and foot, surrounded the petitioner and struck him blows. You hear?"
"I hear, messieurs." "Go on, then," said Defarge.
"Again, on the other hand, they whisper at the fountain," resumed the countryman, "that he is brought down into our country to be executed on the spot, and that he will very certainly be executed. They even whisper that because he has slain Monseigneur, and because Monseigneur was the father of his tenants, serfs, what you will, he will be executed as a parricide. One old man says at the fountain that his right hand, armed with the knife, will be burnt off before his face, that into wounds which will be made in his arms, his breast, and his legs, there will be poured boiling oil, melted lead, hot resin, wax, and sulphur. Finally, that he will be torn limb from limb by 4 strong horses. That old man says all this was actually done to a prisoner who made an attempt on the life of the late King Louis XV. But how do I know if he lies? I am not a scholar." "Listen once again, then, Jacques," said the man with the restless hand and the craving air. "The name of that prisoner was Damiens, and it was all done in open day, in the open streets of this city of Paris, and nothing was more noticed in the vast concourse that saw it done than the crowd of ladies of quality and fashion, who were full of eager attention to the last, Jacques, prolonged until nightfall, when he had lost 2 legs and an arm, and still breathed. And it was done. Why, how old are you?" 35, said the mender of roads, who looked 60. "It was done when you were more than 10 years old. You might have seen it."
"Enough," said Defarge, with grim impatience. "Long live the devil! Go on."
"Well, some whisper this, some whisper that. They speak of nothing else. Even the fountain appears to fall to that tune. At length, on Sunday night, when all the village is asleep, come soldiers, winding down from the prison, and their guns ring on the stones of the little street. Workmen dig, workmen hammer, soldiers laugh and sing. In the morning, by the fountain, there is raised a gallows 40 feet high, poisoning the water." The mender of roads looked through rather than at the low ceiling, and pointed as if he saw the gallows somewhere in the sky. "All work is stopped. All assemble there. Nobody leads the cows out. The cows are there with the rest. At midday, the roll of drums. Soldiers have marched into the prison in the night, and he is in the midst of many soldiers. He is bound as before, and in his mouth there is a gag, tied so, with a tight string, making him look almost as if he laughed." He suggested it by creasing his face with his 2 thumbs, from the corners of his mouth to his ears. "On the top of the gallows is fixed a knife, blade upwards, with its point in the air. He is hanged there, 40 feet high, and is left hanging, poisoning the water." They looked at one another as he used his blue cap to wipe his face, on which the perspiration had started afresh while he recalled the spectacle. "It is frightful, messieurs. How can the women and the children draw water? Who can gossip of an evening under that shadow? Under it, have I said? When I left the village Monday evening as the sun was going to bed, and looked back from the hill, the shadow struck across the church, across the mill, across the prison, seemed to strike across the earth, messieurs, to where the sky rests upon it." The hungry man gnawed one of his fingers as he looked at the other 3, and his finger quivered with the craving that was on him. "That's all, messieurs. I left at sunset, as I had been warned to do, and I walked on that night and half next day, until I met, as I was warned I should, this comrade. With him I came on, now riding and now walking, through the rest of yesterday and through last night, and here you see me." After a gloomy silence, the first Jacques said, "Good. You have acted and recounted faithfully. Will you wait for us a little outside the door?" "Very willingly," said the mender of roads, whom Defarge escorted to the top of the stairs, and leaving seated there, returned. The three had risen, and their heads were together when he came back to the garret. "How say you, Jacques?" demanded number one. "To be registered?" "To be registered as doomed to destruction," returned Defarge. "Magnificent!" croaked the man with craving. "The chateau and all the race?" inquired the first. "The chateau and all the race," returned Defarge. "Extermination!" The hungry man repeated in a rapturous croak, "Magnificent!" and began gnawing another finger. "Are you sure," asked Jacques too of Defarge, "that no embarrassment can rise from our manner of keeping the register? Without doubt it is safe, for no one beyond ourselves can decipher it, but shall we always be able to decipher it? Or, I ought to say, will she?" "Jacques," returned Defarge, drawing himself up, "if Madame, my wife, undertook to keep the register in her memory alone, she would not lose a word of it, not a syllable of it. Knitted in her own stitches and her own symbols, it will always be as plain to her as the sun. Confide in Madame Defarge. It would be easier for the weakest poltroon that lives to erase himself from existence than to erase one letter of his name or crimes from the knitted register of Madame Defarge." There was a murmur of confidence and approval, and then the man who hungered asked, "Is this rustic to be sent back soon? I hope so. He is very simple. Is he not a little dangerous?" "He knows nothing," said Defarge. "At least nothing more than would easily elevate himself to a gallows of the same height. I charge myself with him. Let him remain with me. I will take care of him, and set him on his road. He wishes to see the fine world, the king, the queen, and court. Let him see them on Sunday." "What!" exclaimed the hungry man, staring. "Is it a good sign that he wishes to see royalty and nobility?" "Jacques," said Defarge, "judiciously show a cat milk if you wish her to thirst for it. Judiciously show a dog his natural prey if you wish him to bring it down one day." Nothing more was said, and the mender of roads, being found already dozing on the topmost stair, was advised to lay himself down on the pallet bed and take some rest. He needed no persuasion, and was soon asleep. Worse quarters than Defarge's wine-shop could easily have been found in Paris for a provincial slave of that degree. Saving for a mysterious dread of Madame by which he was constantly haunted, his life was very new and agreeable. But Madame sat all day at her counter, so expressly unconscious of him, and so particularly determined not to perceive that his being there had any connection with anything below the surface, that he shook in his wooden shoes whenever his eye lighted on her. For he contended with himself that it was impossible to foresee what that lady might pretend next, and he felt assured that if she should take into her brightly ornamented head to pretend that she had seen him do a murder, and afterwards flay the victim, she would infallibly go through with it until the play was played out. Therefore, when Sunday came, the mender of roads was not enchanted, though he said he was, to find that Madame was to accompany Monsieur and himself to Versailles. It was additionally disconcerting to have Madame knitting all the way there, in a public conveyance. It was additionally disconcerting yet to have Madame in the crowd in the afternoon, still with her knitting in her hands, as the crowd waited to see the carriage of the King and Queen.
"You work hard, madame," said a man near her. "Yes," answered Madame Defarge. "I have a good deal to do." "What do you make, madame?" "Many things." "For instance?" "For instance," returned Madame Defarge composedly, "shrouds." The man moved a little further away as soon as he could, and the mender of roads fanned himself with his blue cap, feeling it mightily close and oppressive. If he needed a king and queen to restore him, he was fortunate in having his remedy at hand, for soon the large-faced king and the fair-faced queen came in their golden coach, attended by the shining bull's eye of their court, a glittering multitude of laughing ladies and fine lords, and in jewels and silks and powder and splendor, and elegantly spurning figures and handsomely disdainful faces of both sexes, the mender of roads bathed himself, so much to his temporary intoxicating, that he cried, "Long live the king! Long live the queen! Long live everybody and everything!" as if he had never heard of ubiquitous Jacques in his time. Then there were gardens, courtyards, terraces, fountains, green banks, more king and queen, more bull's-eye, more lords and ladies, more long live they all, till he absolutely wept with sentiment. During the whole of this scene, which lasted some 3 hours, he had plenty of shouting and weeping and sentimental company, and throughout Defarge held him by the collar, as if to restrain him from flying at the objects of his brief devotion and tearing them to pieces. "Bravo!" said Defarge, clapping him on the back when it was over like a patron. "You are a good boy." The mender of roads was now coming to himself, and was mistrustful of having made a mistake in his late demonstrations, but no. "You are the fellow we want," said Defarge in his ear. "You make these fools believe that it will last forever. Then they are the more insolent, and it is the nearer ended." "Hey!" cried the mender of roads reflectively. "That's true." "These fools know nothing, or they despise your breath, and would stop it forever and ever, in you or in 100 like you, rather than in one of their own horses or dogs. They only know what your breath tells them. Let it deceive them, then, a little longer. It cannot deceive them too much." Madame Defarge looked superciliously at the client, and nodded in confirmation. "As to you," said she, "you would shout and shed tears for anything, if it made a show and a noise. Say, would you not?" "Truly, madame, I think so, for the moment." "If you were shown a great heap of dolls, and were set upon them to pluck them to pieces, and despoil them for your own advantage, you would pick out the richest and gayest. Say, would you not?" "Truly, yes, madame." "Yes. And if you were shown a flock of birds, unable to fly, and were set upon them to strip them of their feathers for your own advantage, you would set upon the birds of the finest feather, would you not?" "It is true, madame." "You have seen both dolls and birds today," said Madame Defarge, with a wave of her hand towards the place where they had last been apparent. "Now go home." 16. Still knitting. Madame Defarge and Monsieur, her husband, returned amicably to the bosom of Saint Antoine, while a speck in a blue cap toiled through the darkness and through the dust and down the weary miles of avenue by the wayside, slowly tending towards that point of the compass where the chateau of Monsieur the Marquis, now in his grave, listened to the whispering trees. Such ample leisure had the stone faces now for listening to the trees and to the fountain, that the few village scarecrows who, in their quest for herbs to eat and fragments of dead stick to burn, strayed within sight of the great stone courtyard and terrace staircase, had it borne in upon their starved fancy that the expression of the faces was altered. A rumor just lived in the village had a faint and bare existence there, as its people had, that when the knife struck home, the faces changed, from faces of pride to faces of anger and pain. Also, that when that dangling figure was hauled up 40 feet above the fountain, they changed again, and bore a cruel look of being avenged, which they would henceforth bear forever. In the stone face over the great window of the bedchamber, where the murder was done, 2 fine dints were pointed out in the sculptured nose, which everybody recognized, and which nobody had seen of old. And on the scarce occasions when 2 or 3 ragged peasants emerged from the crowd to take a hurried peep at Monseigneur the Marquis petrified, a skinny finger would not have pointed to it for a minute before they all started away among the moss and leaves like the more fortunate hares who could find a living there. Chateau and hut, stone face and dangling figure, the red stain on the stone floor and the pure water in the village well, thousands of acres of land, a whole province of France, all France itself, lay under the night sky, concentrated into a faint, hairbreadth line. So does a whole world, with all its greatnesses and littlenesses, lie in a twinkling star. And as mere human knowledge can split a ray of light and analyze the manner of its composition, so sublimer intelligences may read in the feeble shining of this earth of ours every thought and act, every vice and virtue of every responsible creature on it. The Defarges, husband and wife, came lumbering under the starlight in their public vehicle to that gate of Paris whereunto their journey naturally tended. There was the usual stoppage at the barrier guard-house, and the usual lanterns came glancing forth for the usual examination and inquiry. Monsieur Defarge alighted, knowing 1 or 2 of the soldiery there, and 1 of the police. The latter he was intimate with, and affectionately embraced. When Saint Antoine had again enfolded the Defarges in his dusky wings, and they, having finally alighted near the saint's boundaries, were picking their way on foot through the black mud and offal of his streets, Madame Defarge spoke to her husband. "Say then, my friend, what did Jacques of the police tell thee?" "Very little tonight, but all he knows. There is another spy commissioned for our quarter. There may be many more, for all that he can say, but he knows of one." "Eh, well," said Madame Defarge, raising her eyebrows with a cool business air. "It is necessary to register him. How do they call that man?" "He is English." "So much the better. His name?" "Barsad," said Defarge, making it French by pronunciation. But he had been so careful to get it accurately that he then spelt it with perfect correctness. "Barsad," repeated Madame. "Good. Christian name?" "Jean." "Jean Barsad," repeated Madame, after murmuring it once to herself. "Good. His appearance, is it known?" "Age, about 40 years. Height, about 5 feet 9. Black hair, complexion dark. Generally rather handsome visage. Eyes dark. Face thin, long, and sallow. Nose aquiline, but not straight, having a peculiar inclination towards the left cheek. Expression, therefore, sinister." "Eh, my faith, it is a portrait," said Madame, laughing. "He shall be registered tomorrow." They turned into the wine-shop, which was closed, for it was midnight, and where Madame Defarge immediately took her post at her desk, counting the small moneys that had been taken during her absence, examined the stock, went through the entries in the book, made other entries of her own, checked the serving man in every possible way, and finally dismissed him to bed. Then she turned out the contents of the bowl of money for the second time, and began knotting them up in her handkerchief, in a chain of separate knots for safe keeping through the night. All this while Defarge, with his pipe in his mouth, walked up and down, complacently admiring, but never interfering. in which condition, indeed, as to the business and his domestic affairs, he walked up and down through life. The night was hot, and the shop, close shut and surrounded by so foul a neighborhood, was ill-smelling. Monsieur Defarge's olfactory sense was by no means delicate, but the stock of wine smelt stronger than it ever tasted, and so did the stock of rum and brandy and aniseed. He whiffed the compound of scents away as he put down his smoked-out pipe. "You are fatigued," said Madame, raising her glance as she knotted the money. "There are only the usual odors." "I am a little tired," her husband acknowledged. "You are a little depressed, too," said Madame, whose quick eyes had never been so intent on the accounts, but they had had a ray or two for him. "Oh, the men, the men—" "But, my dear—" began Defarge. "But, my dear," repeated Madame, nodding firmly. "But, my dear, you are faint of heart tonight, my dear." "Well, then," said Defarge, as if a thought were wrung out of his breast, "it is a long time." "It is a long time," repeated his wife. "And when is it not a long time? Vengeance and retribution require a long time. It is the rule." "It does not take a long time to strike a man with lightning," said Defarge. "How long," demanded Madame composedly, "does it take to make and store the lightning? Tell me." Defarge raised his head thoughtfully, as if there were something in that, too. "It does not take a long time," said Madame, "for an earthquake to swallow a town. Well, tell me how long it takes to prepare the earthquake." "A long time, I suppose," said Defarge. "But when it is ready, it takes place and grinds to pieces everything before it. In the meantime, it is always preparing, so it is not seen or heard. That is your consolation. Keep it." She tied a knot with flashing eyes as if it throttled a foe. "I tell thee," said Madame, extending her right hand for emphasis, "that although it is a long time on the road, it is on the road and coming. I tell thee it never retreats and never stops. I tell thee it is always advancing. Look around and consider the lives of all the world that we know. Consider the rage and discontent to which the Jacquerie addresses itself with more and more of certainty every hour. Can such things last? Bah, I mock you." "My brave wife," returned Defarge, standing before her with his head a little bent, and his hands clasped at his back, like a docile and attentive pupil before his catechist. "I do not question all this. But it has lasted a long time, and it is possible, you know well, my wife, it is possible that it may not come during our lives." Well, how then?" demanded Madame, trying another knot, as if there were another enemy strangled. "Well," said Defarge, with a half-complaining and half-apologetic shrug, "we shall not see the triumph." "We shall have helped it," returned Madame, with her extended hand in strong action. "Nothing that we do is done in vain. I believe with all my soul that we shall see the triumph. But even if not, even if I knew certainly not, show me the neck of an aristocrat and tyrant, and still I would—" Then Madame, with her teeth set, tied a very terrible knot indeed. "Hold!" cried Defarge, reddening a little as if he felt charged with cowardice. "I, too, my dear, will stop at nothing." "Yes, but it is your weakness that you sometimes need to see your victim and your opportunity to sustain you. Sustain yourself without that. When the time comes, let loose a tiger and a devil. But wait for the time with the tiger and the devil chained, not shown, yet always ready. Madame enforced the conclusion of this piece of advice by striking her little counter with her chain of money as if she knocked its brains out, and then gathering the heavy handkerchief under her arm in a serene manner and observing that it was time to go to bed. Next noontide saw the admirable woman in her usual place in the wine shop, knitting away assiduously. A rose lay beside her, and if she now and then glanced at the flower, it was with no infraction of her usual preoccupied air. There were a few customers, drinking or not drinking, standing or seated, sprinkled about. The day was very hot, and heaps of flies, who were extending their inquisitive and adventurous perquisitions into all the glutinous little glasses near Madame, fell dead at the bottom. Their decease made no impression on the other flies out promenading, who looked at them in the coolest manner, as if they themselves were elephants or something as far removed, until they met the same fate. Curious to consider how heedless flies are. Perhaps they thought as much at court that sunny summer day. A figure entering at the door threw a shadow on Madame Defarge, which she felt to be a new one. She laid down her knitting and began to pin her rose in her headdress before she looked at the figure. It was curious. The moment Madame Defarge took up the rose, the customers ceased talking and began gradually to drop out of the wine shop. "Good day, madame," said the newcomer. "Good day, monsieur." She said it aloud, but added to herself as she resumed her knitting, "Ha, good day. Age about 40, height about 5'9", black hair, generally rather handsome visage, complexion dark, eyes dark, thin, long, and sallow face, aquiline nose but not straight, having a peculiar inclination towards the left cheek, which imparts a sinister expression. Good day, one and all." "Have the goodness to give me a little glass of old cognac, and a mouthful of cool fresh water, madame." Madame complied with a polite air. "Marvelous cognac, this, madame." It was the first time it had ever been so complimented. Madame Defarge knew enough of its antecedents to know better. She said, however, that the cognac was flattered, and took up her knitting. The visitor watched her fingers for a few moments, and took the opportunity of observing the place in general. "You knit with great skill, madame." "I am accustomed to it." "A pretty pattern, too." "You think so?" said madame, looking at him with a smile. "Decidedly. May one ask what it is for?" "Pastime," said madame, still looking at him with a smile, while her fingers moved nimbly. "Not for use?" "That depends. I may find a use for it one day. If I do, well," said madame, drawing a breath and nodding her head with a stern kind of coquetry, "I'll use it." It was remarkable, but the taste of Saint Antoine seemed to be decidedly opposed to a rose on the headdress of Madame Defarge. Two men had entered separately, had been about to order a drink, when, catching sight of that novelty, they faltered, made a pretense of looking about as if for some friend who was not there, and went away. Nor of those who had been there when this visitor entered there was one left. They had all dropped off. The spy had kept his eyes open, but had been able to detect no sign. They had lounged away in a poverty-stricken, purposeless, accidental manner, quite natural and unimpeachable. "Jean," thought madame, checking off her work as her fingers knitted, and her eyes looked at the stranger. "Stay long enough, and I shall knit bon sang before you go." "You have a husband, madame?" "I have." "Children?" "No children." "Business seems bad." "Business is very bad. The people are so poor." "Ah, the unfortunate, miserable people. So oppressed, too, as you say." "As you say," madame retorted, correcting him and deftly knitting an extra something into his name that boded him no good. "Pardon me. Certainly it was I who said so, but you naturally think so, of course." "I think," returned madame in a high voice.
I and my husband have enough to do to keep this wine shop open without thinking. All we think here is how to live. That is the subject we think of, and it gives us from morning to night enough to think about, without embarrassing our heads concerning others. I think for others? No, no. The spy, who was there to pick up any crumbs he could find or make, did not allow his baffled state to express itself in his sinister face, but stood with an air of gossiping gallantry, leaning his elbow on Madame Defarge's little counter, and occasionally sipping his cognac. "A bad business this, madame, of Gaspard's execution. Ah, the poor Gaspard!" with a sigh of great compassion. "My faith," returned Madame, coolly and lightly, "if people use knives for such purposes, they have to pay for it. He knew beforehand what the price of his luxury was. He has paid the price." "I believe," said the spy, dropping his soft voice to a tone that invited confidence, and expressing an injured, revolutionary susceptibility in every muscle of his wicked face, "I believe there is much compassion and anger in this neighborhood touching the poor fellow, between ourselves." "Is there?" asked Madame vacantly. "Is there not?" "Here is my husband," said Madame Defarge. As the keeper of the wine-shop entered at the door, the spy saluted him by touching his hat, and saying with an engaging smile, "Good day, Jacques." Defarge stopped short and stared at him. "Good day, Jacques," the spy repeated, with not quite so much confidence or quite so easy a smile under the stare. "You deceive yourself, monsieur," returned the keeper of the wine-shop. "You mistake me for another. That is not my name. I am Ernest Defarge." "It is all the same," said the spy, airily, but discomfited too. "Good day." "Good day," answered Defarge dryly. "I was saying to Madame, with whom I had the pleasure of chatting when you entered, that they tell me there is, and no wonder, much sympathy and anger in Saint Antoine touching the unhappy fate of poor Gaspard." "No one has told me so," said Defarge, shaking his head. "I know nothing of it." Having said it, he passed behind the little counter, and stood with his hand on the back of the wife's chair, looking over that barrier at the person to whom they were both opposed, and whom either of them would have shot with the greatest satisfaction. The spy, well used to his business, did not change his unconscious attitude, but drained his little glass of cognac, took a sip of fresh water, and asked for another glass of cognac. Madame Defarge poured it out for him, took to her knitting again, and hummed a little song over it. "You seem to know the quarter well. That is to say, better than I do," observed Defarge. "Not at all, but I hope to know it better. I am so profoundly interested in its miserable inhabitants." "Ha!" muttered Defarge. "The pleasure of conversing with you, Monsieur Defarge, recalls to me," pursued the spy, "that I have the honor of cherishing some interesting associations with your name." "Indeed," said Defarge, with much indifference. "Yes, indeed. When Dr. Manette was released, you, his old domestic, had the charge of him, I know. He was delivered to you. You see, I am informed of the circumstances." "Such is the fact, certainly," said Defarge. He had had it conveyed to him in an accidental touch of his wife's elbow as she knitted and warbled, that he would do best to answer, but always with brevity. "It was to you," said the spy, "that his daughter came, and it was from your care that his daughter took him, accompanied by a neat brown monsieur. How is he called? In a little wig. Lorry, of the Bank of Tellson and Company, over to England." "Such is the fact," repeated Defarge. "Very interesting remembrances," said the spy. "I have known Dr. Manette and his daughter in England." "Yes," said Defarge. "You don't hear much about them now?" said the spy. "No," said Defarge. "In effect," Madame struck in, looking up from her work and her little song, "we never hear about them. we received the news of their safe arrival, and perhaps another letter, or perhaps two, but since then they have gradually taken their road in life, we ours, and we have held no correspondence."
"Perfectly so, madame," replied the spy. "She is going to be married."
"Going?"
echoed madame.
"She was pretty enough to have been married long ago. You English are cold, it seems to me."
"Oh, you know I am English."
"I perceive your tongue is," returned madame. "And what the tongue is, I suppose the man is." He did not take the identification as a compliment, but he made the best of it and turned it off with a laugh. After sipping his cognac to the end, he added, "Yes, Miss Manette is going to be married, but not to an Englishman, to one who, like herself, is French by birth. And speaking of Gaspard, poor Gaspard, it was cruel, cruel. It is a curious thing that she is going to marry the nephew of Monsieur the Marquis, for whom Gaspard was exalted to that height of so many feet. In other words, the present Marquis. But he lives unknown in England. He is no Marquis there. He is Mr. Charles Darnay. D'Aulnay is the name of his mother's family." Madame Defarge knitted steadily, but the intelligence had a palpable effect upon her husband. Do what he would behind the little counter as to the striking of a light and the lighting of his pipe, he was troubled, and his hand was not trustworthy. The spy would have been no spy if he had failed to see it, or to record it in his mind. Having made at least this one hit, whatever it might prove to be worth, and no customers coming in to him to any other, Mr. Bassard paid for what he had drunk and took his leave, taking occasion to say in a genteel manner before he departed that he looked forward to the pleasure of seeing Monsieur and Madame Defarge again. For some minutes after he had emerged into the outer presence of Saint Antoine, the husband and wife remained exactly as he had left them, lest he should come back. "Can it be true?" said Defarge in a low voice, looking down at his wife as he stood smoking with his hand on the back of her chair. "What he has said of Mademoiselle Manette?" "As he has said it," returned Madame, lifting her eyebrows a little. "It is probably false, but it may be true." "If it is—" Defarge began and stopped. "If it is," repeated his wife. "And if it does come while we live to see it triumph, I hope, for her sake, destiny will keep her husband out of France." "Her husband's destiny," said Madame Defarge with her usual composure, "will take him where he is to go, and will lead him to the end that is to end him. That is all I know." "But it is very strange. Now, at least, is it not very strange," said Defarge, rather pleading with his wife to induce her to admit it, "that after all our sympathy for Monsieur her father and herself, her husband's name should be proscribed under your hand at this moment by the side of that infernal dog who has just left us?" "Strange things. Then that will happen when it does come," answered Madame. "I have them both here, of a certainty, and they are both here for their merits. That is enough." She rolled up her knitting when she had said those words, and presently took the rose out of the handkerchief that was wound about her head. Either Saint Antoine had an instinctive sense that the objectionable decoration was gone, or Saint Antoine was on the watch for its disappearance. Howbeit, the saint took courage to lounge in very shortly afterwards, and the wine-shop recovered its habitual aspect. In the evening, at which season of all others Saint Antoine turned himself inside out, and sat on doorsteps and window ledges, and came to the corners of vile streets and courts for a breath of air, Madame Defarge, with her work in her hand, was accustomed to pass from place to place and from group to group. A missionary. There were many like her, such as the world will do well never to breed again. All the women knitted. They knitted worthless things,
But the mechanical work was a mechanical substitute for eating and drinking. The hands moved for the jaws and the digestive apparatus. If the bony fingers had been still, the stomachs would have been more famine-pinched. But as the fingers went, the eyes went, and the thoughts. As Madame Defarge moved on from group to group, all three went quicker and fiercer among every little knot of women that she had spoken with and left behind. Her husband smoked at his door, looking after her with admiration. "A great woman," said he. "A strong woman, a grand woman, a frightfully grand woman." Darkness closed around, and then came the ringing of church bells and the distant beating of the military drums in the palace courtyard, as the women sat knitting. Darkness encompassed them. Another darkness was closing in as surely, when the church bells, then ringing pleasantly in many an airy steeple over France, should be melted into thundering cannon, when the military drums should be beating to drown a wretched voice, that night all potent as the voice of power and plenty, freedom and life. So much was closing in about the women who sat knitting, that they their very selves were closing in around a structure yet unbuilt, where they were to sit knitting, counting dropping heads. 17. One night. Never did the sun go down with a brighter glory on the quiet corner in Soho than one memorable evening when the doctor and his daughter sat under the plane tree together. Never did the moon rise with a milder radiance over great London than on that night when it found them still seated under the tree and shone upon their faces through its leaves. Lucy was to be married tomorrow. She had reserved this last evening for her father, and they sat alone under the plane tree. "You are happy, my dear father?" "Quite, my child." They had said little, though they had been there a long time. When it was yet light enough to work and read, she had neither engaged herself in her usual work, nor had she read to him. She had employed herself in both ways at his side under the tree many and many a time, but this time was not quite like any other, and nothing could make it so. "And I am very happy tonight, dear father. I am deeply happy in the love that heaven has so blessed. My love for Charles, and Charles' love for me. But if my life were not to be still consecrated to you, or if my marriage were so arranged as that it would part us, even by the length of a few of these streets, I should be more unhappy and self-reproachful now than I can tell you. Even as it is," even as it was, she could not command her voice. In the sad moonlight, she clasped him by the neck and laid her face upon his breast. In the moonlight, which is always sad, as the light of the sun itself is, as the light called human life is, at its coming and its going. "Dearest, dear, can you tell me this last time that you feel quite sure no new affections of mine and no new duties of mine will ever interpose between us? I know it well, but do you know it? In your own heart, do you feel quite certain?" Her father answered with a cheerful firmness of conviction he could scarcely have assumed. "Quite sure, my darling. More than that," he added as he tenderly kissed her. "My future is far brighter, Lucy, seen through your marriage, than it could have been, nay, than it ever was without it." "If I could hope that, my father—" "Believe it, love. Indeed, it is so. Consider how natural and how plain it is, my dear, that it should be so. You, devoted and young, cannot fully appreciate the anxiety I have felt that your life should not be wasted." She moved her hand towards his lips, but he took it in his and repeated the word, "Wasted, my child. should not be wasted, struck aside from the natural order of things for my sake. Your unselfishness cannot entirely comprehend how much my mind has gone on this. But only ask yourself, how could my happiness be perfect, while yours was incomplete? If I had never seen Charles, my father, I should have been quite happy with you. He smiled at her unconscious admission that she would have been unhappy without Charles, having seen him, and replied, My child, you did see him, and it is Charles. If it had not been Charles, it would have been another, or if it had been no other, I should have been the cause, and then the dark part of my life would have cast its shadow beyond myself and would have fallen on you. It was the first time, except at the trial, of her ever hearing him refer to the period of his suffering. It gave her strange and new sensation while his words were in her ears, and she remembered it long afterwards. See, said the doctor of Beauvais, raising his hand towards the moon, I have looked at her from my prison window when I could not bear her light. I have looked at her when it has been such torture to me to think of her shining upon what I had lost, that I have beaten my head against my prison walls. I have looked at her in a state so dull and lethargic that I have thought of nothing but the number of horizontal lines I could draw across her at the full, the number of perpendicular lines with which I could intersect them. He added, in his inward and pondering manner, as he looked at the moon, It was 20 either way, I remember, and the 20th was difficult to squeeze in. The strange thrill with which she heard him go back to that time deepened as he dwelt upon it, but there was nothing to shock her in the manner of his reference. He only seemed to contrast his present cheerfulness and felicity with the dire endurance that was over. I have looked at her, speculating thousands of times upon the unborn child from whom I had been rent, whether it was alive, whether it had been born alive, or the poor mother's shock had killed it, whether it was a son who would some day avenge his father. There was a time in my imprisonment when my desire for vengeance was unbearable. Whether it was a son who would never know his father's story, who might even live to weigh the possibility of his father's having disappeared of his own will and act, whether it was a daughter who would grow to be a woman. She drew closer to him and kissed his cheek and his hand. I have pictured my daughter to myself as perfectly forgetful of me, rather altogether ignorant of me and unconscious of me. I have cast up the years of her age, year after year. I have seen her married to a man who knew nothing of my fate. I have altogether perished from the remembrance of the living, and in the next generation my place was a blank. My father, even to hear that you had such thoughts of a daughter who never existed strikes to my heart as if I had been that child. You, Lucy, it is out of the consolation and restoration you have brought to me that these remembrances arise and pass between us and the moon on this last night. What did I say just now? She knew nothing of you. She cared nothing for you. So, but on other moonlight nights, when the sadness and the silence have touched me in a different way, have affected me with something as like a sorrowful sense of peace as any emotion that had pain for its foundations could, I have imagined her as coming to me in my cell and leading me out into the freedom beyond the fortress. I have seen her image on the moonlight often, as I now see you, except that I never held her in my arms. It stood between the little grated window and the door. But you understand that that was not the child I am speaking of. The figure was not the image, the fancy. No, that was another thing. It stood before my disturbed sense of sight, but it never moved. The phantom that my mind pursued was another and more real child. Of her outward appearance I know no more than she was like her mother. The other had that likeness too, as you have, but was not the same. Can you follow me, Lucy? Hardly, I think. I doubt you must have been a solitary prisoner to understand these perplexed distinctions. His collected and calm manner could not prevent her blood from running cold, as he thus tried to anatomize his old condition. In that more peaceful state, I have imagined her, in the moonlight, coming to me, and taking me out to show me that the home of her married life was full of her loving remembrance of her lost father. My picture was in her room, and I was in her prayers. Her life was active, cheerful, useful, but my poor history pervaded it all. I was that child, my father. I was not half so good, but in my love, that was I. And she showed me her children, said the doctor of Beauvais, and they had heard of me, and had been taught to pity me. When they passed the prison of the state, they kept far from its frowning walls, and looked up at its bars and spoke in whispers. She could never deliver me. I imagined that she always brought me back after showing me such things. But then, blessed with the relief of tears, I fell upon my knees and blessed her. I am that child, I hope, my father. Oh, my dear, will you bless me as fervently tomorrow? Lucy, I recall these old troubles, and the reason that I have tonight for loving you better than words can tell, and thanking God for my great happiness. My thoughts, when they were wildest, never rose near the happiness that I have known with you, and that we have before us. He embraced her, solemnly commended her to heaven, and humbly thanked heaven for having bestowed her on him. By and by they went into the house. There was no one bidden to the marriage but Mr. Lorry. There was even to be no bridesmaid but the gaunt Miss Pross. The marriage was to make no change in their place of residence. They had been able to extend it by taking to themselves the upper rooms formerly belonging to the apocryphal invisible lodger, and they desired nothing more. Dr. Manette was very cheerful at the little supper. They were only 3 at table. Miss Pross made the 3rd. He regretted that Charles was not there, was more than half disposed to object to the loving little plot that kept him away, and drank to him affectionately. So the time came for him to bid Lucy good night, and they separated. But in the stillness of the 3rd hour of the morning, Lucy came downstairs again and stole into his room, not free from unshaped fears beforehand. All things, however, were in their places. All was quiet, and he lay asleep, his white hair picturesque on the untroubled pillow, his hands lying quiet on the coverlet. She put her needless candle in the shadow at a distance, crept up to his bed, and put her lips to his, then leaned over him and looked at him. Into his handsome face the bitter waters of captivity had worn, but he covered up their tracks with a determination so strong that he held the mastery of them even in his sleep. A more remarkable face in its quiet, resolute and guarded struggle with an unseen assailant was not to be beheld in all the wide dominions of sleep that night. She timidly laid her hand on his dear breast, and put up a prayer that she might ever be as true to him as her love aspired to be, and as his sorrows deserved. Then she withdrew her hand, and kissed his lips once more, and went away. So the sunrise came, and the shadows of the leaves of the plane tree moved upon his face as softly as her lips had moved in praying for him. 18. 9 days. The marriage day was shining brightly, and they were ready outside the closed door of the doctor's room, where he was speaking with Charles Darnay. They were ready to go to church, the beautiful bride, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross, to whom the event, though a gradual process of reconcilement to the inevitable, would have been one of absolute bliss but for the yet lingering consideration that her brother Solomon should have been the bridegroom. "And so," said Mr. Lorry, who could not sufficiently admire the bride, and who had been moving round her to take in every point of her quiet, pretty dress, "and so it was for this, my sweet Lucy, that I brought you across the channel, such a baby. Lord bless me, how little I thought what I was doing, how lightly I valued the obligation I was conferring on my friend Mr. Charles." "You didn't mean it," remarked the matter-of-fact Miss Pross, "and therefore how could you know it? Nonsense." "Really? Well, but don't cry," said the gentle Mr. Lorry. "I am not crying," said Miss Pross. "You are." "I, my Pross?" By this time Mr. Lorry dared to be pleasant with her on occasion. "You were just now. I saw you do it, and I don't wonder at it. Such a present of plate as you have made him is enough to bring tears into anybody's eyes. There's not a fork or a spoon in the collection," said Miss Pross, "that I didn't cry over last night after the box came till I couldn't see it." "I am highly gratified," said Mr. Lorry, "though, upon my honor, I had no intention of rendering those trifling articles of remembrance invisible to anyone. Dear me, this is an occasion that makes a man speculate on all he has lost. Dear, 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 to think that there might have been a Mrs. Lorry any time these 50 years almost." "Not at all," from Miss Pross. "You think there never might have been a Mrs. Lorry?" asked the gentleman of that name. "Pooh!" rejoined Miss Pross. "You were a bachelor in your cradle." "Well," observed Mr. Lorry, beamingly adjusting his little wig, "that seems probable, too." "And you were cut out for a bachelor," pursued Miss Pross, "before you were put in your cradle." "Then I think," said Mr. Lorry, "that I was very unhandsomely dealt with, and that I ought to have had a voice in the selection of my pattern. Enough. Now, my dear Lucy," drawing his arm soothingly round her waist, "I hear them moving in the next room, and Miss Pross and I, as two formal folks of business, are anxious not to lose the final opportunity of saying something to you that you wish to hear. You leave your good father, my dear, in hands as earnest and as loving as your own. He shall be taken every conceivable care of. During the next fortnight, while you are in Warwickshire and thereabout, even Telson shall go to the wall, comparatively speaking, before him. And when at the fortnight's end he comes to join you and your beloved husband on your other fortnight's trip in Wales, you shall say that we have sent him to you in the best health and in the happiest frame. Now I hear somebody's step coming to the door. Let me kiss my dear girl with an old-fashioned bachelor blessing before somebody comes to claim his own." For a moment he held the fair face from him to look at the well-remembered expression on the forehead, and then laid the bright golden hair against his little brown wig with a genuine tenderness and delicacy which, if such things be old-fashioned, were as old as Adam. The door of the doctor's room opened, and he came out with Charles Darnay. He was so deadly pale, which had not been the case when they went in together, that no vestige of colour was to be seen in his face. But in the composure of his manner he was unaltered, except that to the shrewd glance of Mr. Lorry it disclosed some shadowy indication that the old air of avoidance and dread had lately passed over him like a cold wind. He gave his arm to his daughter, and took her downstairs to the chariot which Mr. Lorry had hired in honor of the day. The rest followed in another carriage, and soon, in a neighbouring church where no strange eyes looked on, Charles Darnay and Lucy Manette were happily married. Besides the glancing tears that shone among the smiles of the little group when it was done, some diamonds, very bright and sparkling, glanced on the bride's hand, which were newly released from the dark obscurity of one of Mr. Lorry's pockets. They returned home to breakfast, and all went well, and in due course the golden hair that had mingled with the poor shoemaker's white locks in the Paris garret were mingled with them again in the morning sunlight on the threshold of the door at parting. It was a hard parting, though it was not for long, but her father cheered her, and said at last, gently disengaging himself from her enfolding arms, "Take her, Charles, she is yours," and her agitated hand waved to them from a chaise window, and she was gone. The corner being out of the way of the idle and curious, and the preparations having been very simple and few, the doctor, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross were left quite alone. It was when they turned into the welcome shade of the cool old hall that Mr. Lorry observed a great change to have come over the doctor, as if the golden arm uplifted there had struck him a poisoned blow. He had naturally repressed much, and some revulsion might have been expected in him when the occasion for repression was gone, but it was the old, scared, lost look that troubled Mr. Lorry, and through his absent manner of clasping his head and drearily wandering away into his own room when they got upstairs, Mr. Lorry was reminded of Defarge, the wine-shop keeper, and the starlight ride. "I think," he whispered to Miss Pross, after anxious consideration, "I think we had best not speak to him just now, or at all disturb him. I must look in at Tellson's, so I will go there at once and come back presently. Then we will take him a ride in the country and dine there, and all will be well." It was easier for Mr. Lorry to look in at Tellson's than to look out of Tellson's. He was detained 2 hours. When he came back, he ascended the old staircase alone. Having asked no question of the servant, going thus into the doctor's rooms, he was stopped by a low sound of knocking. "Good God!" he said with a start. "What's that?" Miss Pross, with a terrified face, was at his ear. "Oh me, all is lost!" cried she, wringing her hands. "What is to be told to Ladybird? He doesn't know me, and is making shoes." Mr. Lorry said what he could to calm her, and went himself into the doctor's room. The bench was turned towards the light, as it had been when he had seen the shoemaker at his work before, and his head was bent down, and he was very busy. "Dr. Manette, my dear friend, Dr. Manette." The doctor looked at him for a moment, half inquiringly, half as if he were angry at being spoken to, and bent over his work again. He had laid aside his coat and waistcoat. His shirt was open at the throat, as it used to be when he did that work, and even the old, haggard, faded surface of face had come back to him. He worked hard, impatiently, as if in some sense of having been interrupted. Mr. Lorry glanced at the work in his hand, and observed that it was a shoe of the old size and shape. He took up another that was lying by him, and asked what it was. "A young lady's walking shoe," he muttered without looking up. "It ought to have been finished long ago. Let it be." "But, Dr. Manette, look at me." He obeyed, in the old, mechanically submissive manner, without pausing in his work. "You know me, my dear friend? Think again. This is not your proper occupation. Think, dear friend." Nothing would induce him to speak more. He looked up for an instant at a time when he was requested to do so, but no persuasion would extract a word from him. He worked and worked and worked in silence, and words fell on him as they would have fallen on an echoless wall or on the air. The only ray of hope that Mr. Lorry could discover was that he sometimes furtively looked up without being asked. In that there seemed a faint expression of curiosity or perplexity, as though he were trying to reconcile some doubts in his mind. 2 things at once impressed themselves on Mr. Lorry as important above all others. The first, that this must be kept secret from Lucy. The second, that it must be kept secret from all who knew him. In conjunction with Miss Pross, he took immediate steps towards the latter precaution by giving out that the doctor was not well and required a few days of complete rest. In aid of the kind deception to be practiced on his daughter, Miss Pross was to write, describing his having been called away professionally, and referring to an imaginary letter of 2 or 3 hurried lines in his own hand, represented to have been addressed to her by the same post. These measures, advisable to be taken in any case, Mr. Lorry took in the hope of his coming to himself. If that should happen soon, he kept another course in reserve, which was to have a certain opinion that he thought the best on the doctor's case. In the hope of his recovery, and of resort to this third course being thereby rendered practicable, Mr. Lorry resolved to watch him attentively, with as little appearance as possible of doing so. He therefore made arrangements to absent himself from Tellson's for the first time in his life, and took his post by the window in the same room. He was not long in discovering that it was worse than useless to speak to him, since on being pressed he became worried. He abandoned that attempt on the first day, and resolved merely to keep himself always before him, as a silent protest against the delusion into which he had fallen or was falling. He remained, therefore, in his seat near the window, reading and writing, and expressing in as many pleasant and natural ways as he could think of that it was a free place. Dr. Manette took what was given him to eat and drink, and worked on that first day until it was too dark to see, worked on half an hour after Mr. Lorry could not have seen for his life to read or write. When he put his tools aside as useless until morning, Mr. Lorry rose and said to him, "Will you go out?" He looked down at the floor on either side of him in the old manner, looked up in the old manner, and repeated in the old low voice, "Out?" "Yes, for a walk with me. Why not?" He made no effort to say why not, and said not a word more. But Mr. Lorry thought he saw, as he leaned forward on his bench in the dusk, with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, that he was in some misty way asking himself why not. The sagacity of the man of business perceived an advantage here and determined to hold it. Miss Pross and he divided the night into 2 watches, and observed him at intervals from the adjoining room. He paced up and down for a long time before he lay down, but when he did finally lay himself down, he fell asleep. In the morning he was up betimes, and went straight to his bench and to work. On this second day Mr. Lorry saluted him cheerfully by his name, and spoke to him on topics that had been of late familiar to them. He returned no reply, but it was evident that he heard what was said, and that he thought about it, however confusedly. This encouraged Mr. Lorry to have Miss Pross in with her work several times during the day. At those times they quietly spoke of Lucy and of her father, then present, precisely in the usual manner, as if there were nothing amiss. This was done without any demonstrative accompaniment, not long enough or often enough to harass him, and it lightened Mr. Lorry's friendly heart to believe that he looked up oftener, and that he appeared to be stirred by some perception of inconsistencies surrounding him. When it fell dark again, Mr. Lorry asked him, as before, "Dear doctor, will you go out?" As before, he repeated, "Out?" "Yes, for a walk with me. Why not?" This time Mr. Lorry feigned to go out when he could extract no answer from him, and after remaining absent for an hour returned. In the meanwhile the doctor had removed to the seat in the window, and had sat there looking down at the plane tree. But on Mr. Lorry's return he slipped away to his bench. The time went very slowly on, and Mr. Lorry's hope darkened, and his heart grew heavier again, and grew yet heavier and heavier every day. The 3rd day came and went, the 4th, the 5th, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days. With a hope ever darkening, and with a heart always growing heavier and heavier, Mr. Lorry passed through this anxious time. The secret was well kept, and Lucy was unconscious and happy. But he could not fail to observe that the shoemaker, whose hands had been a little out at first, was growing dreadfully skilful, and that he had never been so intent on his work, and that his hands had never been so nimble and expert as in the dusk of the 9th evening. 19. An opinion. Worn out by anxious watching, Mr. Lorry fell asleep at his post. On the 10th morning of his suspense, he was startled by the shining of the sun into the room where a slumber had overtaken him when it was dark night. He rubbed his eyes and roused himself, but he doubted when he had done so whether he was not still asleep, for going to the door of the doctor's room and looking in, he perceived that the shoemaker's bench and tools were put aside again, and that the doctor himself sat reading at the window. He was in his usual morning dress, and his face, which Mr. Lorry could distinctly see, though still very pale, was calmly studious and attentive. Even when he had satisfied himself that he was awake, Mr. Lorry felt giddily uncertain for some few moments whether the late shoemaking might not be a disturbed dream of his own. For did not his eyes show him his friend before him, in his accustomed clothing and aspect, and employed as usual? And was there any sign within their range that the change of which he had so strong an impression had actually happened? It was but the inquiry of his first confusion and astonishment, the answer being obvious. If the impression were not produced by a real corresponding and sufficient cause, how came he, Jarvis Lorry, there? How came he to have fallen asleep in his clothes on the sofa in Dr. Manette's consulting room, and to be debating these points outside the doctor's bedroom door in the early morning? Within a few minutes, Miss Pross stood whispering at his side. If he had had any particle of doubt left, her talk would of necessity have resolved it. But he was by that time clear-headed, and had none. He advised that they should let the time go by until regular breakfast hour, and should then meet the doctor as if nothing unusual had occurred. If he appeared to be in his customary state of mind, Mr. Lorry would then cautiously proceed to seek direction and guidance from the opinion he had been, in his anxiety, so anxious to obtain. Miss Pross submitting herself to his judgment, the scheme was worked out with care. Having abundance of time for his usual methodical toilet, Mr. Lorry presented himself at the breakfast hour in his usual white linen, and with his usual neat leg. The doctor was summoned in the usual way, and came to breakfast. So far as it was possible to comprehend him without overstepping those delicate and gradual approaches which Lorry felt to be the only safe advance, he at first supposed that his daughter's marriage had taken place yesterday. An incidental allusion, purposely thrown out to the day of the week and the day of the month, set him thinking and counting, and evidently made him uneasy. In all other respects, however, he was so composedly himself that Mr. Lorry determined to have the aid he sought, and that aid was his own. Therefore, when the breakfast was done and cleared away, and he and the doctor were left together, Mr. Lorry said feelingly, "My dear Manette, I am anxious to have your opinion, in confidence, on a very curious case in which I am deeply interested. That is to say, it is very curious to me. Perhaps to your better information it may be less so." Glancing at his hands, which were discolored by his late work, the doctor looked troubled and listened attentively. He had already glanced at his hands more than once. "Dr. Manette," said Mr. Lorry, touching him affectionately on the arm, "the case is the case of a particularly dear friend of mine. Pray give your mind to it, and advise me well for his sake, and above all for his daughter's, my dear Manette." "If I understand," said the doctor in a subdued tone, "some mental shock." "Yes." "Be explicit," said the doctor. "Spare no detail." Mr. Lorry saw that they understood one another, and proceeded. "My dear Manette, it is the case of an old and prolonged shock, of great acuteness and severity to the affections, the feelings, the
as you express it, the mind. The mind. It is the case of a shock under which the sufferer was borne down, one cannot say for how long, because I believe he cannot calculate the time himself, and there are no other means of getting at it. It is the case of a shock from which the sufferer recovered by a process that he cannot trace himself, as I once heard him publicly relate in a striking manner. It is the case of a shock from which he has recovered so completely as to be a highly intelligent man, capable of close application of mind and great exertion of body, and of constantly making fresh additions to his stock of knowledge, which was already very large. But, unfortunately, there has been—" He paused and took a deep breath. "A slight relapse," the doctor in a low voice asked.
"Of how long duration?"
9 days and nights.
"How did it show itself?" "I infer, glancing at his hands again, in the resumption of some old pursuit connected with the shock."
"That is the fact."
"Now, did you ever see him?" asked the doctor, distinctly and collectedly, though in the same low voice. "Engaged in that pursuit originally?"
"Once."
"And when the relapse fell on him, was he in most respects, or in all respects, as he was then?"
"I think in all respects."
"You spoke of his daughter. Does his daughter know of the relapse?"
"No. It has been kept from her, and I hope will always be kept from her. It is known only to myself and to one other who may be trusted."
The doctor grasped his hand and murmured, "That was very kind. That was very thoughtful." Mr. Lorry grasped his hand in return, and neither of the two spoke for a little while.
"Now, my dear Manette," said Mr. Lorry, at length, in his most considerate and most affectionate way, "I am a mere man of business, and unfit to cope with such intricate and difficult matters. I do not possess the kind of information necessary. I do not possess the kind of intelligence I want guiding. There is no man in this world on whom I could so rely for right guidance as on you. Tell me, how does this relapse come about? Is there danger of another? Could a repetition of it be prevented? How should a repetition of it be treated? How does it come about at all? What can I do for my friend? No man ever can have been more desirous in his heart to serve a friend than I am to serve mine, if I knew how, but I don't know how to originate in such a case. If your sagacity, knowledge, and experience could put me on the right track, I might be able to do so much. Unenlightened and undirected, I can do so little. Pray, discuss it with me. Pray, enable me to see it a little more clearly, and teach me how to be a little more useful."
Dr. Manette sat meditating after these earnest words were spoken, and Mr. Lorry did not press him. "I think it probable," said the doctor, breaking silence with an effort, "that the relapse you have described, my dear friend, was not quite unforeseen by its subject."
"Was it dreaded by him?"
Mr. Lorry ventured to ask. "Very much." He said it with an involuntary shudder. "You have no idea how such an apprehension weighs on the sufferer's mind, and how difficult, how almost impossible it is for him to force himself to utter a word upon the topic that oppresses him."
"Would he," asked Mr. Lorry, "be sensibly relieved if he could prevail upon himself to impart that secret brooding to anyone when it is on him?"
"I think so. But it is, as I told you, next to impossible. I even believe it, in some cases, to be quite impossible."
"Now," said Mr. Lorry, gently laying his hand on the doctor's arm again, after a short silence on both sides. "To what would you refer this attack?"
"I believe," returned Dr. Manette, "that there had been a strong and extraordinary revival of the train of thought and remembrance that was the first cause of the malady. Some intense associations of the most distressing nature were vividly recalled, I think. It is probable that there had long been a dread lurking in his mind that those associations would be recalled, say, under certain circumstances, say, on a particular occasion. He tried to prepare himself in vain. Perhaps the effort to prepare himself made him less able to bear it."
"Would he remember what took place in the relapse?" asked Mr. Lorry with natural hesitation.
The doctor looked desolately round the room, shook his head, and answered in a low voice, "Not at all."
"Now, as to the future," hinted Mr. Lorry.
"As to the future," said the doctor, recovering firmness, "I should have great hope. As it pleased Heaven in its mercy to restore him so soon, I should have great hope. He, yielding under the pressure of a complicated something, long dreaded and long vaguely foreseen and contended against, and recovering after the cloud had burst and passed, I should hope the worst was over."
Well, that's good comfort. I am thankful," said Mr. Lorry.
"I am thankful," repeated the doctor, bending his head with reverence.
"There are 2 other points," said Mr. Lorry, "on which I am anxious to be instructed. I may go on?"
"You cannot do your friend a better service." The doctor gave him his hand.
"To the first, then. He is of a studious habit, and unusually energetic. He applies himself with great ardor to the acquisition of professional knowledge, to the conducting of experiments, to many things. Now, does he do too much?"
"I think not. It may be the character of his mind to be always in singular need of occupation. That may be in part natural to it, in part the result of affliction. The less it was occupied with healthy things, the more it would be in danger of turning in the unhealthy direction. He may have observed himself and made the discovery."
"You are sure that he is not under too great a strain?"
"I think I am quite sure of it."
"My dear Manette, if he were overworked now—"
"My dear Lorry, I doubt if that could easily be. There has been a violent stress in one direction, and it needs a counterweight."
"Excuse me, as a persistent man of business, assuming for a moment that he was overworked, it would show itself in some renewal of this disorder?"
"I do not think so. I do not think," said Dr. Manette with the firmness of self-conviction, "that anything but the one train of association would renew it. I think that henceforth nothing but some extraordinary jarring of that cord could renew it. After what has happened, and after his recovery, I find it difficult to imagine any such violent sounding of that string again. I trust, and I almost believe, that the circumstances likely to renew it are exhausted." He spoke with the diffidence of a man who knew how slight a thing would overset the delicate organization of the mind, and yet with the confidence of a man who had slowly won his assurance out of personal endurance and distress. It was not for his friend to abate that confidence. He professed himself more relieved and encouraged than he really was, and approached his second and last point. He felt it to be the most difficult of all, but remembering his old Sunday morning conversation with Miss Pross, and remembering what he had seen in the last 9 days, he knew that he must face it.
"The occupation resumed under the influence of this passing affliction so happily recovered from," said Mr. Lorry, clearing his throat, "we will call blacksmith work. blacksmith work. We will say, to put a case and for the sake of illustration, that he had been used in his bad time to work at a little forge. We will say that he was unexpectedly found at his forge again. Is it not a pity that he should keep it by him?"
The doctor shaded his forehead with his hand and beat his foot nervously on the ground.
"You do not find it easy to advise me?" said Mr. Lorry. "I quite understand it to be a nice question, and yet I think—"
And there he shook his head and stopped. "You see," said Dr. Manette, turning to him after an uneasy pause, "it is very hard to explain consistently the innermost workings of this poor man's mind. He once yearned so frightfully for that occupation. It was so welcome when it came. No doubt it relieved his pain so much by substituting the perplexity of the fingers for the perplexity of the brain, and by substituting, as he became more practiced, the ingenuity of the hands for the ingenuity of the mental torture, that he has never been able to bear the thought of putting it quite out of his reach. Even now, when I believe he is more hopeful of himself than he has ever been, and even speaks of himself with a kind of confidence, the idea that he might need that old employment and not find it gives him a sudden sense of terror, like that which one may fancy strikes to the heart of a lost child. He looked like his illusion as he raised his eyes to Mr. Lorry's face.
"But may not, mind, I ask for information as a plodding man of business who only deals with such material objects as guineas, shillings, and banknotes. May not the retention of the thing involve the retention of the idea? If the thing were gone, my dear Manette, might not the fear go with it? In short, is it not a concession to the misgiving to keep the forge?"
There was another silence. "You see, too," said the doctor tremulously, "it is such an old companion."
"I would not keep it," said Mr. Lorry, shaking his head, for he gained in firmness as he saw the doctor disquieted. "I would recommend him to sacrifice it. I only want your authority. I am sure it does no good. Come, give me your authority like a dear, good man. For his daughter's sake, my dear Manette."
Very strange to see what a struggle there was within him. "In her name, then, let it be done. I sanction it. But I would not take it away while he was present. Let it be removed when he is not there. Let him miss his old companion after an absence." Mr. Lorry readily engaged for that, and the conference was ended. They passed the day in the country. The doctor was quite restored. On the 3 following days he remained perfectly well, and on the 14th day he went away to join Lucy and her husband. The precaution that had been taken to account for his silence, Mr. Lorry had previously explained to him, and he had written to Lucy in accordance with it, and she had no suspicions. On the night of the day on which he left the house, Mr. Lorry went into his room with a chopper, saw, chisel, and hammer, attended by Miss Pross carrying a light. There, with closed doors, and in a mysterious and guilty manner, Mr. Lorry hacked the shoemaker's bench to pieces, while Miss Pross held the candle as if she were assisting at a murder, for which, indeed, in her grimness she was no unsuitable figure. The burning of the body, previously reduced to pieces convenient for the purpose, was commenced without delay in the kitchen fire, and the tools, shoes, and leather were buried in the garden. So wicked do destruction and secrecy appear to honest minds, that Mr. Lorry and Miss Pross, while engaged in the commission of their deed and in the removal of its traces, almost felt and almost looked like accomplices in a horrible crime. 20. A plea. When the newly married pair came home, the first person who appeared to offer his congratulations was Sidney Carton. They had not been at home many hours when he presented himself. He was not improved in habits or in looks or in manner, but there was a certain rugged air of fidelity about him, which was new to the observation of Charles Darnay. He watched his opportunity of taking Darnay aside into a window, and of speaking to him when no one overheard. "Mr. Darnay," said Carton, "I wish we might be friends." "We are already friends, I hope." "You are good enough to say so, as a fashion of speech. But I don't mean any fashion of speech. Indeed, when I say I wish we might be friends, I scarcely mean quite that, either." Charles Darnay, as was natural, asked him in all good humor and good fellowship what he did mean. "Upon my life," said Carton, smiling, "I find it easier to comprehend in my own mind than to convey to yours. However, let me try. You remember a certain famous occasion when I was more drunk than usual?" "I remember a certain famous occasion when you forced me to confess that you had been drinking." "I remember it, too. The curse of those occasions is heavy upon me, for I always remember them. I hope it may be taken into account one day, when all days are at an end for me. Don't be alarmed, I am not going to preach." "I am not at all alarmed. Earnestness in you is anything but alarming to me." "Ah," said Carton, with a careless wave of his hand as if he waved that away. "On the drunken occasion in question, one of a large number, as you know, I was insufferable about liking you and not liking you. I wish you would forget it." "I forgot it long ago." "Fashion of speech again. But, Mr. Darnay, oblivion is not so easy to me as you represent it to be to you. I have by no means forgotten it, and a light answer does not help me to forget it." "If it was a light answer," returned Darnay, "I beg your forgiveness for it. I had no other object than to turn a slight thing, which, to my surprise, seems to trouble you too much, aside. I declare to you on the faith of a gentleman that I have long dismissed it from my mind." "Good heaven, what was there to dismiss? If I had nothing more important to remember than the great service you rendered me that day." "As to the great service," said Carton, "I am bound to avow to you, when you speak of it in that way, that it was mere professional claptrap. I don't know that I cared what became of you when I rendered it. Mind, I say, when I rendered it. I am speaking of the past." "You make light of the obligation," returned Darnay, "but I will not quarrel with your light answer. Genuine truth, Mr. Darnay, trust me. I have gone aside from my purpose. I was speaking about our being friends. Now, you know me. You know I am incapable of all the higher and better flights of men. If you doubt it, ask Stryver, and he'll tell you so. I prefer to form my own opinion without the aid of his." "Well, at any rate, you know me as a dissolute dog who has never done any good and never will." "I don't know that you never will, but I do, and you must take my word for it." "Well, if you could endure to have such a worthless fellow, and a fellow of such indifferent reputation, coming and going at odd times, I should ask that I might be permitted to come and go as a privileged person here, that I might be regarded as an useless, and I would add, if it were not for the resemblance I detected between you and me, an unornamental piece of furniture, tolerated for its old service and taken no notice of. I doubt if I should abuse the permission. It is 100 to 1 if I should avail myself of it 4 times in a year. It would satisfy me, I dare say, to know that I had it." "Will you try?" "That is another way of saying that I am placed on the footing I have indicated. I thank you, Darnay. I may use that freedom with your name?"
I think so, Carton, by this time.
They shook hands upon it, and Sidney turned away. Within a minute afterwards he was, to all outward appearance, as unsubstantial as ever. When he was gone, and in the course of an evening passed with Miss Pross, the doctor, and Mr. Lorry, Charles Darnay made some mention of this conversation in general terms, and spoke of Sidney Carton as a problem of carelessness and recklessness. He spoke of him, in short, not bitterly, or meaning to bear hard upon him, but as anybody might who saw him as he showed himself. He had no idea that this could dwell in the thoughts of his fair young wife, but when he afterwards joined her in their own rooms, he found her waiting for him with the old pretty lifting of the forehead strongly marked.
"We are thoughtful tonight," said Darnay, drawing his arm about her.
"Yes, dearest Charles," with her hands on his breast and the inquiring and attentive expression fixed upon him. "We are rather thoughtful tonight, for we have something on our mind tonight."
"What is it, my Lucy?"
"Will you promise not to press one question on me if I beg you not to ask it?"
"Will I promise? What will I not promise to my love?"
What indeed, with his hand putting aside the golden hair from the cheek, and his other hand against the heart that beat for him. "I think, Charles, poor Mr. Carton deserves more consideration and respect than you expressed for him tonight."
"Indeed, my own, why so?"
"That is what you are not to ask me, but I know he does."
"If you know it, it is enough. What would you have me do, my life?"
"I would ask you, dearest, to be very generous with him always, and very lenient on his faults when he is not by. I would ask you to believe that he has a heart he very, very seldom reveals, and that there are deep wounds in it. My dear, I have seen it bleeding."
"It is a painful reflection to me," said Charles Darnay, quite astounded, "that I should have done him any wrong. I never thought this of him."
"My husband, it is so. I fear he is not to be reclaimed. There is scarcely a hope that anything in his character or fortunes is reparable now. But I am sure that he is capable of good things, gentle things, even magnanimous things."
She looked so beautiful in the purity of her faith in this lost man that her husband could have looked at her as she was for hours.
"And, oh, my dearest love," she urged, clinging nearer to him, laying her head upon his breast and raising her eyes to his, "remember how strong we are in our happiness, and how weak he is in his misery."
The supplication touched him home. "I will always remember it, dear heart. I will remember it as long as I live." He bent over the golden head and put the rosy lips to his and folded her in his arms. If one forlorn wanderer, then pacing the dark streets, could have heard her innocent disclosure, and could have seen the drops of pity kissed away by her husband from the soft blue eyes so loving of that husband, he might have cried to the night, and the words would not have parted from his lips for the first time, "God bless her for her sweet compassion." 21. Echoing Footsteps. A wonderful corner for echoes. It has been remarked, that corner where the doctor lived, ever busily winding the golden thread which bound her husband and her father and herself and her old directress and companion in a life of quiet bliss, Lucy sat in a still house on a tranquilly resounding corner, listening to the echoing footsteps of years. At first there were times, though she was a perfectly happy young wife, when her work would slowly fall from her hands, and her eyes would be dimmed, for there was something coming in the echoes, something light, afar off, and scarcely audible yet, that stirred her heart too much. Fluttering hopes and doubts, hopes of a love as yet unknown to her,
doubts of her remaining upon earth to enjoy that new delight divided her breast. Among the echoes, then, there would arise the sound of footsteps at her own early grave, and thoughts of the husband who would be left so desolate, and who would mourn for her so much, swelled to her eyes and broke like waves. That time passed, and her little Lucy lay on her bosom. Then, among the advancing echoes, there was the tread of her tiny feet, and the sound of her prattling words. Let greater echoes resound as they would, the young mother at the cradle-side could always hear those coming. They came, and the shady house was sunny with a child's laugh, and the divine friend of children, to whom in her trouble she had confided hers, seemed to take her child in his arms, as he took the child of old, and made it a sacred joy to her. Ever busily winding the golden thread that bound them all together, weaving the service of her happy influence through the tissue of all their lives and making it predominate nowhere, Lucy heard in the echoes of years none but friendly and soothing sounds. Her husband's step was strong and prosperous among them, her father's firm and equal, low Miss Pross in harness of string awakening the echoes, as an unruly charger, whip-corrected, snorting and pawing the earth under the plane tree in the garden. Even when there were sounds of sorrow among the rest, they were not harsh nor cruel. Even when golden hair like her own lay in a halo on a pillow round the worn face of a little boy, and he said with a radiant smile, "Dear Papa and Mamma, I am very sorry to leave you both, and to leave my pretty sister, but I am cold, and I must go." Those were not tears all of agony that wetted his young mother's cheek, as the spirit departed from her embrace that had been entrusted to it. Suffer them, and forbid them not. They see my Father's face. O Father, blessed words! Thus the rustling of an angel's wings got blended with the other echoes, and they were not wholly of earth, but had in them that breath of heaven. Sighs of the winds that blew over a little garden tomb were mingled with them also, and both were audible to Lucy in a hushed murmur, like the breathing of a summer sea asleep upon a sandy shore. As the little Lucy, comically studious at the task of the morning, or dressing a doll at her mother's footstool, chattered in the tongues of the two cities that were blended in her life. The echoes rarely answered to the actual tread of Sidney Carton. Some half-dozen times a year, at most, he claimed his privilege of coming in uninvited, and would sit among them through the evening, as he had once done often. He never came there heated with wine. And one other thing regarding him was whispered in the echoes, which has been whispered by all true echoes for ages and ages. No man ever really loved a woman, lost her, and knew her with a blameless, though an unchanged mind, when she was a wife and a mother. But her children had a strange sympathy with him, an instinctive delicacy of pity for him. What fine hidden sensibilities are touched in such a case, no echoes tell. But it is so, and it was so here. Carton was the first stranger to whom little Lucy held out her chubby arms, and he kept his place with her as she grew. The little boy had spoken of him almost at the last. "Poor Carton, kiss him for me." Mr. Stryver shouldered his way through the law, like some great engine forcing itself through turbid water, and dragged his useful friend in his wake like a boat towed astern. As the boat so favored is usually in a rough plight, and mostly under water, so Sidney had a swamped life of it. But easy and strong custom, unhappily so much easier and stronger in him than any stimulating sense of desert or disgrace, made it the life he was to lead, and he no more thought of emerging from his state of lion's jackal than any real jackal may be supposed to think of rising to be a lion. Stryver was rich, had married a florid widow with property and 3 boys, who had nothing particularly shining about them but the straight hair of their dumpling heads. These three young gentlemen, Mr. Stryver, exuding patronage of the most offensive quality from every pore, had walked before him like three sheep to the quiet corner in Soho, and had offered as pupils to Lucy's husband, delicately saying, "Hello! Here are 3 lumps of bread and cheese towards your matrimonial picnic, Darnay." The polite rejection of the 3 lumps of bread and cheese had quite bloated Mr. Stryver with indignation, which he afterwards turned to account in the training of the young gentlemen by directing them to beware of the pride of beggars, like that tutor fellow. He was also in the habit of declaiming to Mrs. Stryver, over his full-bodied wine, on the arts Mrs. Darnay had once put in practice to catch him, and on the diamond-cut diamond arts in himself, madam, which had rendered him not to be caught. Some of his King's Bench familiars, who were occasionally parties to the full-bodied wine and the lie, excused him for the latter by saying that he had told it so often that he believed it himself, which is surely such an incorrigible aggravation of an originally bad offense as to justify any such offenders being carried off to some suitably retired spot and there hanged out of the way. These were among the echoes to which Lucy, sometimes pensive, sometimes amused and laughing, listened in the echoing corner until her little daughter was 6 years old. How near to her heart the echoes of her child's tread came, and those of her own dear father's, always active and self-possessed, and those of her dear husband's need not be told, nor how the lightest echo of their united home, directed by herself with such a wise and elegant thrift that it was more abundant than any waste, was music to her, nor how there were echoes all about her, sweet in her ears, of the many times her father had told her that he found her more devoted to him married, if that could be, than single, and of the many times her husband had said to her that no cares and duties seemed to divide her love for him or her help to him, and asked her, "What is the magic secret, my darling, of your being everything to all of us, as if there were only one of us, yet never seeming to be hurried or to have too much to do?" But there were other echoes, from a distance, that rumbled menacingly in the corner all through this space of time, and it was now, about little Lucy's 6th birthday, that they began to have an awful sound, as of a great storm in France, with a dreadful sea rising. On a night in mid-July, 1789, Mr. Lorry came in late from Tellson's and sat himself down by Lucy and her husband in the dark window. It was a hot, wild night, and they were all 3 reminded of the old Sunday night when they had looked at the lightning from the same place. "I began to think," said Mr. Lorry, pushing his brown wig back, "that I should have to pass the night at Tellson's. We have been so full of business all day that we have not known what to do first, or which way to turn. There is such an uneasiness in Paris that we have actually a run of confidence upon us. Our customers over there seem not to be able to confide their property to us fast enough. There is positively a mania among some of them for sending it to England." "That has a bad look," said Darnay. "A bad look, you say, my dear Darnay? Yes, but we don't know what reason there is in it. People are so unreasonable. Some of us at Tellson's are getting old, and we really can't be troubled out of the ordinary course without due occasion." "Still," said Darnay, "you know how gloomy and threatening the sky is." "I know that, to be sure," assented Mr. Lorry, trying to persuade himself that his sweet temper was soured and that he grumbled, "but I am determined to be peevish after my long day's botheration. Where is Manette?" "Here he is," said the doctor, entering the dark room at the moment. "I am quite glad you are at home. These hurries and forebodings by which I have been surrounded all day long have made me nervous without reason. You are not going out, I hope?" "No, I am going to play backgammon with you, if you like," said the doctor. "I don't think I do like, if I may speak my mind. I am not fit to be pitted against you tonight. Is the tea-board still there, Lucy? I can't see." "Of course, it has been kept for you." "Thank ye, my dear.
The precious child is safe in bed and sleeping soundly. That's right, all safe and well. I don't know why anything should be otherwise than safe and well here, thank God, but I have been so put out all day, and I am not as young as I was. My tea, my dear, thank ye. Now come and take your place in the circle, and let us sit quiet and hear the echoes about which you have your theory. Not a theory, it was a fancy. Ah, fancy then, my wise pet, said Mr. Lorry, patting her hand. They are very numerous and very loud, though, are they not? Only hear them.
Headlong, mad, and dangerous footsteps to force their way into anybody's life. Footsteps not easily made clean again if once stained red. The footsteps raging in St. Antoine afar off, as the little circle sat in the dark London window. St. Antoine had been, that morning, a vast, dusky mass of scarecrows heaving to and fro, with frequent gleams of light above the billowy heads, where steel blades and bayonets shone in the sun. A tremendous roar arose from the throat of St. Antoine, and a forest of naked arms struggled in the air like shriveled branches of trees in a winter wind, all the fingers convulsively clutching at every weapon or semblance of a weapon that was thrown up from the depths below, no matter how far off. Who gave them out? Whence they last came? Where they began? Through what agency they crookedly quivered and jerked, scores at a time, over the heads of the crowd like a kind of lightning? No eye in the throng could have told. But muskets were being distributed. So were cartridges, powder and ball, bars of iron and wood, knives, axes, pikes, every weapon that distracted ingenuity could discover or devise. People who could lay hold of nothing else set themselves with bleeding hands to force stones and bricks out of their places in walls. Every pulse and heart in St. Antoine was on high fever strain and at high fever heat. Every living creature there held life as of no account, and was demented with a passionate readiness to sacrifice it. As a whirlpool of boiling waters has a center point, so all this raging circled round Defarge's wine shop, and every human drop in the cauldron had a tendency to be sucked towards the vortex, where Defarge himself, already begrimed with gunpowder and sweat, issued orders, issued arms, thrust this man back, dragged this man forward, disarmed one to arm another, labored and strove in the thickest of the uproar. "Keep near to me, Jacques 3, cried Defarge, "and do you, Jacques 1 and 2, separate and put yourselves at the head of as many of these patriots as you can. Where is my wife?" "Well, here you see me," said Madame, composed as ever, but not knitting today. Madame's resolute right hand was occupied with an axe in place of the usual softer implements, and in her girdle were a pistol and a cruel knife. "Where do you go, my wife?" "I go," said Madame, "with you at present. You shall see me at the head of women by and by." "Come then," cried Defarge in a resounding voice. "Patriots and friends, we are ready. The Bastille!" With a roar that sounded as if all the breath in France had been shaped into the detested word, the living sea rose, wave on wave, depth on depth, and overflowed the city to that point. Alarm bells ringing, drums beating, the sea raging and thundering on its new beach, the attack begun. Deep ditches, double drawbridge, massive stone walls, 8 great towers, cannon, muskets, fire and smoke. Through the fire and through the smoke, in the fire and in the smoke, for the sea cast him up and against a cannon, and on the instant he became a cannoneer. Defarge of the wine shop worked like a manful soldier 2 fierce hours. Deep ditch, single drawbridge, massive stone walls, 8 great towers, cannon, muskets, fire and smoke, 1 drawbridge down. "Work, comrades all, work! Work, Jacques 1, Jacques 2, Jacques 1000, Jacques 2000, Jacques 5 and 20,000, in the name of all the angels or devils, which you prefer, work!" Thus Defarge of the wine shop, still at his gun, which had long grown hot. "To me, women!" cried Madame his wife.
What? We can kill as well as the men when the place is taken?
And to her, with a shrill, thirsty cry, trooping women variously armed, but all armed alike in hunger and revenge. Cannon, muskets, fire and smoke, but still the deep ditch, the single drawbridge, the massive stone walls, and the 8 great towers. Slight displacements of the raging sea made by the falling wounded. Flashing weapons, blazing torches, smoking wagon loads of wet straw, hard work at neighboring barricades in all directions, shrieks, volleys, execrations, bravery without stint, boom, smash, and rattle, and the furious sounding of the living sea. But still the deep ditch, and the single drawbridge, and the massive stone walls, and the 8 great towers, and still Defarge of the wine shop at his gun, grown doubly hot by the service of 4 fierce hours. A white flag from within the fortress, and a parley, this dimly perceptible through the raging storm, nothing audible in it. Suddenly the sea rose immeasurably, wider and higher, and swept Defarge of the wine shop over the lowered drawbridge, past the massive stone outer walls, in among the 8 great towers, surrendered. So resistless was the force of the ocean bearing him on, that even to draw his breath or turn his head was as impracticable as if he had been struggling in the surf at the South Sea, until he was landed in the outer courtyard of the Bastille. There, against an angle of a wall, he made a struggle to look about him. Jacques III was nearly at his side. Madame Defarge, still heading some of her women, was visible in the inner distance, and her knife was in her hand. Everywhere was tumult, exultation, deafening and maniacal bewilderment, astounding noise, yet furious dumb show. "The prisoners! The records! The secret cells! The instruments of torture! The prisoners!" Of all these cries, and 10,000 incoherencies, the prisoners was the cry most taken up by the sea that rushed in, as if there were an eternity of people, as well as of time and space. When the foremost billows rolled past, bearing the prison officers with them, and threatening them all with instant death if any secret nook remained undisclosed, Defarge laid his strong hand on the breast of one of these men, a man with a grey head, who had a lighted torch in his hands, separated him from the rest, and got him between himself and the wall. "Show me the North Tower," said Defarge. "Quick!" "I will, faithfully," replied the man, "if you will come with me, but there is no one there." "What is the meaning of 105 North Tower?" asked Defarge. "Quick!" "The meaning, monsieur? Does it mean a captive or a place of captivity? Or do you mean that I shall strike you dead?" "Kill him!" croaked Jacques III, who had come close up. "Monsieur, it is a cell." "Show it me." "Pass this way, then." Jacques III, with his usual craving on him, and evidently disappointed by the dialogue taking a turn that did not seem to promise bloodshed, held by Defarge's arm as he held by the turnkey's. Their 3 heads had been close together during this brief discourse, and it had been as much as they could do to hear one another, even then. So tremendous was the noise of the living ocean, in its eruption into the fortress, and its inundation of the courts and passages and staircases. All around, outside, too, it beat the walls with a deep, hoarse roar, from which, occasionally, some partial shouts of tumult broke and leaped into the air like spray. Through gloomy vaults, where the light of day had never shone, past hideous doors of dark dens and cages, down cavernous flights of steps, and again up steep rugged ascents of stone and brick, more like dry waterfalls than staircases, Defarge, the turnkey, and Jacques III, linked hand and arm, went with all the speed they could make. Here and there, especially at first, the inundation started on them and swept by, but when they had done descending, and were winding and climbing up a tower, they were alone. Hemmed in here by the massive thickness of walls and arches, the storm within the fortress and without was only audible to them in a dull, subdued way, as if the noise out of which they had come had almost destroyed their sense of hearing. The turnkey stopped at a low door, put a key in a clashing lock, swung the door slowly open, and said, as they all bent their heads and passed in, 105 North Tower. There was a small, heavily grated, unglazed window high in the wall, with a stone screen before it, so that the sky could be only seen by stooping low and looking up. There was a small chimney, heavily barred across a few feet within. There was a heap of old feathery wood ashes on the hearth. There was a stool, a table, and a straw bed. There were the 4 blackened walls, and a rusted iron ring in one of them. "Pass that torch slowly along these walls, that I may see them," said Defarge to the turnkey. "Stop! Look here, Jacques." "A.M.," creaked Jacques 3 as he read greedily. "Alexandre Manette," said Defarge in his ear, following the letters with his swart forefinger deeply ingrained with gunpowder. "And here he wrote, 'A poor physician.' And it was he, without doubt, who scratched the calendar on this stone. What is that in your hand? A crowbar? Give it me." He had still the linstock of his gun in his own hand. He made a sudden exchange of the 2 instruments, and turning on the worm-eaten stool and table, beat them to pieces in a few blows. "Hold the light higher," he said wrathfully to the turnkey. "Look among those fragments with care, Jacques. And see, here is my knife," throwing it to him. "Rip open that bed and search the straw. Hold the light higher, you!" With a menacing look at the turnkey, he crawled upon the hearth, and peering up the chimney, struck and prized at its sides with the crowbar, and worked at the iron grating across it. In a few minutes, some mortar and dust came dropping down, which he averted his face to avoid. And in it, and in the old wood ashes, and in a crevice in the chimney into which his weapon had slipped or wrought itself, he groped with a cautious touch. "Nothing in the wood and nothing in the straw, Jacques? Nothing? Let us collect them together in the middle of the cell. So. Light them, you!" The turnkey fired the little pile, which blazed high and hot. Stooping again to come out at the low arched door, they left it burning, and retraced their way to the courtyard, seeming to recover their sense of hearing as they came down until they were in the raging flood once more. They found it surging and tossing in quest of Defarge himself. Saint Antoine was clamorous to have its wine-shop keeper foremost in the guard upon the governor who had defended the Bastille and shot the people. Otherwise the governor would not be marched to the Hôtel de Ville for judgment. Otherwise the governor would escape, and the people's blood, suddenly of some value after many years of worthlessness, be unavenged. In the howling universe of passion and contention that seemed to encompass this grim old officer, conspicuous in his grey coat and red decoration, there was but one quite steady figure, and that was a woman's. "See, there is my husband," she cried, pointing him out. "See, Defarge!" She stood immovable close to the grim old officer, and remained immovable close to him through the streets, as Defarge and the rest bore him along, remained immovable close to him when he was got near his destination and began to be struck at from behind, remained immovable close to him when the long gathering rain of stabs and blows fell heavy, was so close to him when he dropped dead under it, that suddenly animated, she put her foot upon his neck, and with her cruel knife, long ready, hewed off his head. The hour was come when Saint Antoine was to execute his horrible idea of hoisting up men for lamps, to show what he could be and do. Saint Antoine's blood was up, and the blood of tyranny and domination by the iron hand was down on the steps of the Hôtel de Ville, where the governor's body lay, down on the sole of the shoe of Madame Defarge, where she had trodden on the body to steady it for mutilation. "Lower the lamp yonder!" cried Saint Antoine, after glaring round for a new means of death.
"Here is one of his soldiers to be left on guard."
The swinging sentinel was posted, and the sea rushed on. The sea of black and threatening waters, and of destructive upheaving of wave against wave, whose depths were not yet unfathomed, and whose forces were yet unknown. The remorseless sea of turbulently swaying shapes, voices of vengeance, and faces hardened in the furnaces of suffering until the touch of pity could make no mark on them. But in the ocean of faces where every fierce and furious expression was in vivid life, there were two groups of faces, each 7 in number, so fixedly contrasting with the rest, that never did sea roll which bore more memorable wrecks with it. 7 faces of prisoners, suddenly released by the storm that had burst their tomb, were carried high overhead, all scared, all lost, all wandering and amazed, as if the last day were come, and those who rejoiced around them were lost spirits. Other 7 faces there were, carried higher, 7 dead faces, whose drooping eyelids and half-seen eyes awaited the last day. Impassive faces, yet with a suspended, not an abolished, expression on them. Faces rather in a fearful pause, as having yet to raise the dropped lids of the eyes, and bear witness with the bloodless lips, "Thou didst it." 7 prisoners released, 7 gory heads on pikes, the keys of the accursed fortress of the 8 strong towers, some discovered letters and other memorials of prisoners of old time, long dead of broken hearts, such and such like, the loudly echoing footsteps of Saint Antoine escort through the Paris streets in mid-July, 1789. Now, heaven defeat the fancy of Lucy Darnay, and keep these feet far out of her life, for they are headlong, mad, and dangerous. And in the years so long after the breaking of the cask at Defarge's wine-shop door, they are not easily purified when once stained red.